In 1983, a single frictionless glide transformed a pop star into a global deity. Yet, the defining dance move of the 20th century hides a deliberately erased origin. 4 decades before the world cheered for the Moonwalk, a brilliant rhythm tap dancer named Bill Bailey executed that exact illusion on film. He engineered a cinematic masterpiece, only to watch a segregated Hollywood machine steal his innovation and bury his name. Why did the true pioneer of this legendary move abandon mainstream glory, pack away his tap shoes, and vanish into a quiet church? Born Willie Eugene Bailey in December 1912, he entered a Jim Crow America designed to crush black ambition. Survival meant invisibility, but Bailey's talent made that impossible. Rejecting the frantic, subservient acrobatics demanded by white booking agents, he engineered a revolutionary physical vocabulary. By manipulating microscopic muscle tension, he cheated gravity, gliding across rough oak floorboards as if they were frictionless ice. This wasn't mere entertainment. It was a masterful intellectual command of the human anatomy. And this acoustic genius was about to drag him directly into the brutal crosshairs of the American entertainment machine. The epicenter of this acoustic warfare was the Apollo Theater in Harlem. During the 1930s and 1940s, Harlem functioned as a cultural, artistic, and intellectual nuclear reactor for Black America, and the Apollo was its fiercely guarded core. When Bill Bailey stepped onto that legendary stage, he did not enter a polite venue of gentle applause. He entered a sweat-drenched, high-stakes proving ground. Sharing the billing with musical titans like Duke Ellington, Miles Davis, and Cab Calloway, Bailey was an undisputed sovereign. His rhythm tap was a masterclass in kinetic control, a rapid-fire percussive assault that left seasoned veterans staring in sheer disbelief. He could stretch a rhythm to the absolute breaking point and then seamlessly transition into the impossible frictionless glide of the backslide. The crowds at the Apollo roared, elevating him to the status of a local deity night after grueling night. Yet, a brutal, invisible ceiling hung heavily over the Apollo stage. The mid-century American entertainment machine operated on a strictly segregated, ruthlessly hypocritical calculus. White booking agents, theater syndicate owners, and Hollywood producers were perfectly willing to sell tickets to black audiences and extract massive, unregulated profits from black talent within the confined, heavily policed spaces of the segregated touring circuits. They would gladly sit in the darkened VIP balconies, meticulously observing the groundbreaking innovations erupting on the wooden floorboards below. But the heavy gold-plated doors to mainstream superstardom, the multi-million-dollar cinematic contracts, the nationwide television syndication, the global immortality, were violently and permanently slammed shut. The white establishment possessed a very specific, rigidly enforced expectation of what a black dancer was permitted to be. The underlying cultural mandate was absolute. Black performers could be dynamic physical novelties, wild athletes, or eager-to-please entertainers, but they were strictly forbidden from being framed as serious, sophisticated leading artists. Hollywood actively hoarded the prestige for its own carefully curated white idols. The industry systematically absorbed the brilliant, syncopated algorithms engineered by men like Bill Bailey, capturing their moves on film only to dilute and launder them through the sanitized, heavily promoted performances of the white cinematic elite. Bailey found himself trapped in a devastating schizophrenic paradox. Within the borders of Harlem, he was an untouchable king of rhythm, a man whose feet generated fortunes. But the exact moment the stage lights dimmed and he walked out the back alley door of the theater, that sovereignty evaporated. He stepped onto the streets of America and was instantly reduced to a second-class citizen. He possessed an intellect and a physical mastery that completely eclipsed the biggest names on the silver screen. Yet he was legally prohibited from sitting at the lunch counters of the very cities he sold out. The capitalist machine did not just extract his physical labor, it actively weaponized his skin color to deny his humanity, creating a suffocating pressure cooker of racial injustice that was quietly preparing to exact a terrifying psychological toll. The Hollywood studio system of the 1940s and 1950s was a highly calibrated machine. When Bill Bailey transitioned from the stages of Harlem to these pristine sound stages, he crossed a dangerous threshold. The industry did not act as a patron of black art. It functioned as a refinery. It existed to extract the kinetic energy of African American culture, sanitize it, and package it for mass consumption, often stripping the original artists of their dignity in the process. Bill Bailey did not have to look far to witness the terrifying toll of this machinery. The most agonizing, intimate proof of this cultural extortion was playing out in real time through the ascent of his own sister, Pearl Bailey. Pearl possessed an undeniable gravitational charisma. She was a powerhouse vocalist and a commanding actress, a woman whose sheer talent was a force of nature. Yet as Bill stood in the shadows of the wings, watching her navigate the executive boardrooms and the casting calls, he witnessed the heavy, humiliating racial tax she was forced to pay for her mainstream survival. In an era dictated by the deeply conservative Southern distribution networks, Hollywood executives operated under a strict, unyielding mandate regarding race. Black performers were categorically denied the complexity of full human existence on the silver screen. They were never the romantic leads. They were never the heroic architects of their own destiny. Pearl, a woman of towering intellect and regal presence, was repeatedly handed scripts that required her to actively diminish her own light. To secure the lucrative contracts to keep her face on the movie posters, she was forced to navigate a humiliating gauntlet of racial caricatures. She was offered roles as the sassy maid, the comedic relief, the subservient companion, who existed solely to prop up the narrative arc of the white protagonists. Bill watched his sister, a queen in her own right, carefully modulate her voice, adjust her posture, and deliver punchlines designed to make prejudiced audiences feel comfortable with her presence. He saw the microscopic moments of hesitation in her eyes before she smiled for the cameras, the agonizing silent calculations of a brilliant artist deciding exactly how much of her soul she had to carve away just to be allowed in the room. This sibling dynamic served as a devastating real-time mirror for Bill Bailey's own predicament. The white studio moguls sitting in their plush, mahogany-lined offices looked at Bill's staggering physical capabilities and saw a highly volatile, immensely valuable natural resource. They were utterly mesmerized by the mathematical perfection of his rhythm tap and the terrifying frictionless illusion of his backslide. But they did not want Bill Bailey, the man. They did not want a proud, uncompromising black intellectual commanding their stages. They wanted the algorithm of his feet, entirely divorced from the humanity of his body. The industry's strategy for handling Bill Bailey was a masterclass in corporate exploitation. They utilized a loophole in cinematic production known as the specialty number. Because theater owners in the Jim Crow South would violently boycott any film that integrated black and white performers into the same narrative storyline, Hollywood confined black geniuses like Bailey to isolated, self-contained musical segments. He was brought onto the sound stage, the cameras rolled, and he unleashed the breathtaking, physics-defying magic of his footwork. But the moment the music stopped, he vanished from the film. These specialty numbers were strategically placed so that projectionists in the Deep South could literally take a pair of scissors, physically splice Bill Bailey out of the celluloid reel, and seamlessly play the rest of the movie for white audiences without ever acknowledging his existence. He was earning a paycheck, but he was participating in his own systematic erasure. The cameras were not capturing his performance to immortalize his legacy. They were operating as an archiving mechanism for a grand cultural theft. The studio executives locked the raw footage of his routines in their subterranean vaults. They treated his physical movements as open source material. Behind closed doors, in the sprawling rehearsal bungalows of Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer and 20th Century Fox, white choreographers would meticulously study the celluloid prints of Bill Bailey's backslide. They dissected the microscopic weight shifts, the isolated ankle control, and the exact muscular tension required to execute the illusion. They broke his genius down into a set of mechanical instructions and then grafted those stolen movements onto the bodies of the heavily promoted, highly paid white cinematic idols of the era. Bill Bailey was forced to swallow the bitter, jagged reality that his life's work was being actively plagiarized by the very institution that refused to grant him a leading role. He walked the streets of Los Angeles and saw the names of white dancers glowing in neon above the grand movie palaces, dancers who were receiving prestigious awards and global adoration for executing watered-down, diluted versions of the exact rhythmic algorithms he'd invented in the freezing alleyways of his youth. The system was engaging in a brazen, unapologetic laundering of black intellectual property. They took the fire of the Harlem Hoofers Club, extinguished the danger, painted a white face over it, and sold it to the world as spontaneous white ingenuity. The psychological friction of existing within this space became unbearable. Every time Bill Bailey laced up his metal-plated shoes and stepped onto a studio lot, he felt the suffocating weight of the compromise. The casting directors continuously pushed him to lighten up, demanding the mandatory wide-eyed minstrel grin that signaled subservience. They wanted him to abandon the stoic aristocratic posture that defined his scientific rhythm and revert to the frantic, eager-to-please pantomime of the vaudeville flash acts. They were offering him a devil's bargain. He could have the money, he could have the fleeting moments of screen time, but the entrance fee was his dignity. He had to agree to become a clown so they could comfortably steal his science. Looking at the aging veterans of the tap circuit, the brilliant black men who had mentored him, who had danced until their knees shattered and their feet bled, only to end up impoverished and forgotten while the industry grew fat on their innovations, Bill Bailey experienced a profound, terrifying awakening. He saw the terminal trajectory of his own life written in the broken bodies of his predecessors and the compromised scripts handed to his sister. He realized that the applause of the white establishment was not a measure of respect. It was the sound of a transaction completing. They were buying pieces of his identity, one syncopated strike at a time, until there would be nothing left but a hollow, exhausted shell. The stage, which had once been his absolute sanctuary, his kingdom of acoustic sovereignty, began to feel like a brightly lit auction block. The joy of the rhythm, the pure, unadulterated thrill of manipulating gravity with his feet, was being systematically poisoned by the profound moral rot of the industry surrounding him. Bill Bailey was a man of towering, uncompromising pride, and he was rapidly approaching an ideological precipice. He was beginning to understand that surviving Hollywood did not require physical endurance. It required a spiritual amputation that he was fundamentally unwilling to perform. The quiet, simmering rage building within his chest was not the frantic desperation of a defeated man. It was the cold, clarifying fury of a sovereign artist preparing to burn the bridge to an empire that did not deserve his art. The relentless, grinding schedule of the mid-century vaudeville and theater circuit offered absolutely no sanctuary for a mind in the midst of a profound ideological crisis. When the heavy soundproof doors of the Hollywood studios closed behind him, Bill Bailey was immediately thrust back into the punishing, unforgiving velocity of the road. The geography of his existence was instantly defined by the suffocating, claustrophobic dimensions of segregated train cars and the damp, windowless dressing rooms of theaters, scattered across a racially fractured nation. The rhythmic clacking of the locomotive wheels against the iron tracks did not offer the comforting lullaby of travel. For the African-American performer shackled to this touring machine, it was the relentless, grinding heartbeat of an industrial slaughterhouse. He was carrying a staggering, invisible burden. He possessed the towering intellect of a master composer, yet he was forced to navigate a daily reality where his physical safety and fundamental dignity were constantly under threat. The cognitive dissonance was deafening. Every time he laced his heavy leather tap shoes across his aching arches, he was actively participating in a system that demanded his physical exhaustion while orchestrating his historical erasure. He knew with cold certainty that the revolutionary footwork he had bled to perfect was currently being stripped of its black origins. They were being projected onto massive silver screens across the country, generating vast, unregulated fortunes for white executives who viewed him with thinly veiled contempt. The physical toll of executing high-speed, mathematically complex tap routines 4 to 5 times a day was immense and unforgiving. The human ankle and knee are highly complex, fragile mechanisms, entirely unsuited for the explosive, high-impact friction of driving metal taps into solid stage floors for hours on end. Bailey's developing joints were subjected to a continuous bruising compression. His feet blistered, bled, and calloused over, only to blister again. In the dimly lit backstage quarters that smelled sharply of stale sweat, cheap grease paint, and the lingering cigar smoke of the theater managers, he would quietly wrap his aching feet in thick bandages. He was a man in the absolute prime of his life, yet he carried the excruciating, bone-deep weariness of an elderly laborer. Yet the physical agony of the vaudeville grind was merely the baseline of his torment. The true lethal poison lay in the psychological theater of the performance itself. The white audiences filling the plush seats in the darkened auditoriums did not pay the price of admission to witness the serious intellectual acoustic science that Bailey had perfected. The cultural appetite of the era required black performers to be dynamic, hyperkinetic visual spectacles, wild, sweating athletes who hurled their bodies across the stage. More insidiously, the system required a specific facial expression to accompany this physical degradation. The dancers were mandated under the unspoken threat of being blacklisted by the theater owners to project an aura of frantic, subservient joy. They were required to stretch their mouths into a wide, eager-to-please grin. The white establishment needed to be comforted by the illusion that these performers were perfectly happy caricatures, existing solely for their patronizing amusement. Navigating this extreme cognitive dissonance day after day was slowly tearing the architecture of Bailey's mind apart. On the stage, he was a sovereign, untouchable king of rhythm, a musical genius executing kinetic algorithms that left seasoned jazz musicians staring in profound disbelief. But the exact moment the heavy velvet curtain fell, that sovereignty evaporated into the cold, racist reality of mid-century America. He would walk out the back door of the theater, the thunderous applause still echoing in his ears, and step into an alleyway where he was instantly reduced to a second-class citizen. He possessed the talent to pack massive theaters, generating astronomical wealth for the syndicates, yet he was legally prohibited from sitting at the lunch counter of the diner next door. He was forced to walk to the colored-only establishments on the edge of town just to secure a hot meal after a grueling 14-hour shift. The human nervous system is an incredibly resilient organ, but it possesses absolute unforgiving limits. You cannot systematically extract every ounce of physical energy from a highly sensitive artist, subject them to the daily violent whiplash of public adoration and systemic degradation, force them to witness the brazen theft of their life's work, and expect their psychological fortifications to hold. The quiet, simmering rage that had taken root in the Hollywood rehearsal bungalows began to mutate into a profound, suffocating despair. The pristine mathematics of his rhythm tap, the beautiful, highly structured sanctuary of his mind, began to feel less like a weapon of defiance and more like the rattling bars of a gilded cage. In the dimly lit, smoke-filled basements of the 1940s and 1950s jazz clubs, where the greatest black musicians of the era gathered after the commercial theaters had closed, a lethal, silent epidemic was taking hold. The introduction of heavy narcotics into this specific cultural ecosystem was not a moral failing, nor was it a sudden descent into reckless hedonism. It was, in its most tragic, unvarnished reality, a desperate form of self-medication. For a generation of African American artists carrying the crushing weight of a racist empire, from Charlie Parker to Billie Holiday, heroin offered an immediate, devastatingly effective anesthetic. Under the chemical veil of heavy narcotics, the unrelenting noise of Jim Crow America simply ceased to exist. The suffocating pressure to smile for prejudiced audiences, the reality of stolen intellectual property, and the physical weariness of the touring circuit melted into a detached, synthetic silence. The narcotic did not offer joy. It offered the desperate relief of feeling nothing at all. For a man like Bill Bailey, whose entire existence was predicated on the hyper-focused, microscopic manipulation of time and friction, the chemical alteration of his reality was a terrifyingly seductive trap. Under the influence of the narcotic, the frenetic, demanding tempo of the world slowed to a crawl. The harsh, blinding Klieg lights of the studios dimmed. The bitter anger that threatened to consume him was entirely neutralized. He found a chemical shield against the horrific realization that he was dancing to enrich the very men who oppressed him. When he stepped onto the wooden floorboards in this chemically altered state, the pristine architecture of his dance began to fundamentally fracture. The backslide lost its aggressive intellectual sharpness, mutating into a slower, heavily sedated ghost of its former execution. The descent was not an immediate, explosive collapse. It was a slow, terrifying erosion of his aristocratic discipline. The razor-sharp 16th note variations that had once defined his scientific rhythm began to blur at the edges. The perfect, rigid alignment of his spine, his physical declaration of intellectual sovereignty, began to visibly slacken. The immaculate, custom-tailored suits that had once armored him against the indignities of the road hung loosely on a frame that was rapidly consuming itself. The auditory supercomputer inside his mind, the genius that could once translate the chaotic noise of the streets into perfect symphonies, was now heavily muted, drowned out by the thick synthetic fog of the opiate. The white establishment watched this deterioration with a chilling, absolute apathy. The theater managers, the booking agents, and the Hollywood executives who had profited so handsomely from his flawless execution offered no safety net, no medical intervention, and absolutely no respite from the grueling schedule. In the ruthless calculus of the entertainment machine, a performer struggling with addiction was not a human being in crisis. He was simply a depreciating asset. The industry operated on a brutal logic. A broken tool is discarded, not repaired. The moment his timing faltered, the moment the physical toll of the narcotics compromised his ability to pack the theaters and generate revenue, the industry coldly and efficiently prepared to cut the cord. They had successfully extracted the raw material of his genius. They had locked his foundational movements in their film vaults, legally transferred his intellectual property to their white stars, and now they were entirely content to let the hollowed-out shell of the man collapse into the gutters. He became a ghost haunting the margins of his own kingdom. The younger dancers at the Hoofers Club and the Apollo, men who had once studied his every microscopic weight shift with sheer reverence, now watched him with a mixture of awe and profound, helpless sorrow. They recognized that the architect of the backslide was trapped in a labyrinth of his own making, battling a darkness that the spotlight could never penetrate. Bill Bailey was drowning in the epicenter of the culture he had helped to build, his brilliant mind slowly fragmenting under the combined weight of systemic theft and severe chemical dependency. The machine had nearly executed its perfect crime. They had pushed him to the absolute brink of total annihilation, leaving him to wither in the shadows while the world prepared to dance to the rhythm he had bled to create. The absolute bottom of a chemical abyss is not a sudden, dramatic impact. It is a cold, silent realization that you have become the very ghost you once feared. For Bill Bailey, standing on the precipice of the late 1940s, The reflection in the dressing room mirror offered a terrifying verdict. The kinetic deity of the Harlem Hoofers Club, the aristocratic architect of the backslide, had been hollowed out. The veins in his arms bore the violent physical ledger of his desperate attempts to numb the psychological friction of Jim Crow America. He was surrounded by the decaying remnants of his peers, brilliant, irreplaceable African-American intellects who had been chewed up by the vaudeville circuit and spat out into the gutters, their bodies broken by the punishing schedules, and their minds shattered by the systemic theft of their art. Bailey was trapped in the terminal velocity of the capitalist's entertainment machine, and the needle was quietly preparing to finalize the transaction. But the tragedy of Bill Bailey does not end in the squalor of an overdose. The most breathtaking, deeply radical act of his entire existence did not occur on a wooden stage under blinding Klieg lights. It occurred in the quiet, agonizing darkness of his own mind. Rather than fading into obscurity as a tragic statistic, Bailey made a profound, quiet pivot. The catalyst for this profound pivot arrived wrapped in the guise of the ultimate Hollywood prize. In 1949, the white power brokers of the cinematic syndicates approached Bailey with a highly publicized, incredibly lucrative offer. They wanted him to star in a major motion picture, stepping into the leading role to portray the legendary tap dancer Bill Bojangles Robinson. On paper, it was the crowning achievement, a guaranteed massive paycheck, nationwide billing, and the kind of mainstream exposure that black artists were systematically denied. It was the golden ticket he and his sister Pearl had supposedly been bleeding for. To the white studio executives, the offer was a magnanimous gesture of inclusion. To Bill Bailey, it was an insult of catastrophic proportions. Bailey possessed a razor-sharp, uncompromising historical clarity. He respected the undeniable pioneer status of Bojangles Robinson, but he was intimately aware of the agonizing racial compromises Robinson had been forced to make to survive in his era. Bojangles was the archetype of the acceptable black entertainer for white audiences. The famously smiling, non-threatening, eager-to-please dancer who famously held the hand of little Shirley Temple. Robinson was required to project an aura of perpetual, subservient joy, effectively acting as a comforting buffer for a segregated society. The Hollywood executives were not offering Bailey a chance to showcase his own serious, sophisticated scientific rhythm. They were handing him a massive sum of money to actively resurrect the ghost of a smiling caricature. They were asking him to immortalize the very minstrelsy that he had spent his entire youth fighting to eradicate from his art form. He looked at the towering stack of contracts. He looked at the weekly salary that could buy out entire neighborhoods. And then he looked at the invisible heavy chains attached to the bottom line. In a moment of terrifying absolute sovereignty, Bill Bailey said no. He did not negotiate. He did not ask for script revisions. He flatly, coldly rejected the pinnacle of the American entertainment machine. The shock waves that ripped through the executive boardrooms were palpable. The corporate architects of the studio system operated on the fundamental assumption that every artist had a breaking point, a precise monetary figure that would successfully purchase their soul. The concept of a black man, especially one struggling with the devastating grip of a narcotic addiction and the looming threat of poverty, Looking a syndicate of white millionaires in the eye and refusing their money was entirely incomprehensible. It was a direct, unapologetic short-circuiting of their entire power structure. This refusal was the agonizing genesis of his withdrawal. Severing the ties with the Hollywood machine was relatively simple compared to the brutal, visceral war he had to wage against his own nervous system. Detoxing from heavy narcotics in the mid-20th century was not a sanitized medical procedure conducted in a luxury rehabilitation facility. It was a solitary, violent descent into a physiological hell. Locked in a sparse room, Bailey endured the bone-crushing tremors, the terrifying hallucinations, and the suffocating cold sweats as his body screamed for the chemical anesthetic he had cut off. Every nerve ending previously numbed to the horrific realities of his marginalized existence was violently reawakened. Yet, as the toxic fog slowly burned out of his bloodstream, the pristine architecture of his mind began to rebuild itself. He realized with a profound, sobering clarity that the rhythm had never belonged to the heroine, and it certainly had never belonged to the white booking agents who claimed ownership of his celluloid ghost. The complex mathematical algorithms that allowed him to manipulate gravity were a divine, untouchable inheritance. The industry had desperately tried to buy his genius, and when he refused to sell it on their humiliating terms, they had tried to drive him mad. Surviving the withdrawal fundamentally altered his internal geography. The simmering, toxic rage that had previously driven him to self-destruction crystallized into a cold, impenetrable armor. He looked at the glittering, blood-stained machinery of the vaudeville circuits and the cinematic palaces, and he recognized them for exactly what they were: a sprawling, decentralized plantation system designed to extract black excellence and convert it into white capital. He understood that to step back onto those stages, to accept another specialty number in the back of a segregated film reel, was to actively participate in his own spiritual amputation. Bill Bailey made the deliberate, highly calculated decision to starve the machine of its fuel. He gathered his meticulously tailored suits. He packed away the heavy metal-plated shoes that had generated millions of dollars for men who despised him. He walked out of the dressing rooms, turned his back on the blinding flashbulbs, and stepped out into the quiet, unlit streets. He was not a defeated man retreating into the shadows. He was a sovereign king choosing to walk away from a poisoned throne. He possessed the staggering capability to effortlessly outdance any white idol Hollywood could manufacture. But he recognized that true, absolute power lay in the ability to deny them the privilege of watching him do it. The physical act of severing a lifelong identity does not occur with the explosive roar of a Hollywood climax. It happens in the profound, heavy silence of a closed room. When Bill Bailey returned to his Harlem apartment after surviving the physiological hell of his withdrawal, he walked into his bedroom and opened the closet. He reached down and picked up the heavy, custom-made leather tap shoes, equipped with the thick steel plates that had defined his entire existence. These were not merely pieces of footwear. They were the precise instruments through which he had communicated his genius to the world. They carried the accumulated weight of 1,000 segregated stages, the invisible stains of sweat and blood from the vaudeville circuit, and the terrifying echo of 1,000,000 stolen applause. Holding them in the dim light, he felt the cool metal of the taps against his palms. He did not throw them in a fit of rage. He did not curse the industry that had driven him to the brink of annihilation. With a slow, deliberate finality, he placed the shoes on the highest shelf, closed the wooden door, and turned his back on the 20th century American entertainment machine. This quiet motion was the most radical, devastatingly powerful choreography of his entire life. It was a complete, unapologetic rejection of the capitalist altar, where black artists were systematically sacrificed. The transition from Bill Bailey, the kinetic deity of the Hoofers Club, to Reverend Willie Eugene Bailey, a man of the cloth, was not a surrender. It was a calculated ascension. He traded the suffocating, windowless dressing rooms and the blinding, interrogating glare of the Klieg lights for the solemn, soaring architecture of the church. The sensory environment of his existence fundamentally shifted. The sharp metallic strikes of his feet against solid oak were replaced by the soft, rustling pages of Scripture and the low, resonant hum of a choir. The stale scent of grease paint, cigar smoke, and desperate ambition that permeated the theater corridors was entirely eradicated by the smell of polished wooden pews and burning wax. He did not lose his voice when he left the stage. He simply elevated his frequency. He stepped up to the pulpit, looking out over a congregation comprised of the very people who had once packed the balconies to watch him dance. Many of them were aging musicians, exhausted dancers, and marginalized citizens of Harlem who were intimately familiar with the brutal machinery that Bailey had just escaped. When Reverend Bailey spoke, he possessed a gravitational authority that no studio script could ever manufacture. He commanded the room not with frantic acrobatics or a manufactured subservient grin, but with the quiet, terrifying, absolute certainty of a man who had walked through the valley of the shadow of death and successfully negotiated his own release. He had stared directly into the abyss of addiction, looked into the cold eyes of the white syndicate bosses who wished to purchase his soul, and walked away with his humanity entirely intact. His sermons were not abstract theological lectures. They were profound, lived testaments to the supreme necessity of guarding one's own dignity against an empire designed to strip it away. For years, the industry assumed he had simply faded into the tragic obscurity reserved for discarded novelties. The Hollywood studios continued to churn out highly sanitized, highly profitable dance musicals, freely utilizing the physical vocabulary Bailey had engineered. The backslide, the complex polyrhythms, the flawless ankle isolations, all of his stolen intellectual property was actively generating fortunes for men who had forgotten his name. Bailey watched this grand cultural theft unfold from the quiet sanctuary of his church, and he felt absolutely no compulsion to reclaim his stolen crown. He recognized that the silver screen was a monument to artifice, a brightly lit graveyard where authentic black culture was constantly buried beneath layers of white commercialism. He had secured a peace that the industry could neither comprehend nor confiscate. But the year 1955 presented a unique, highly specific convergence of circumstances. The Apollo Theater, the fiercely guarded epicenter of black artistic excellence, was hosting a massive showcase, a gathering of the greatest musical and kinetic minds of the era. Reverend Bailey was approached not by predatory booking agents holding exploitative contracts, but by his own community. He was asked to return to the legendary floorboards for a single night, a performance entirely divorced from the soul-crushing demands of the commercial circuit. When he agreed to step back onto the stage, it was not driven by a desperate, lingering thirst for the spotlight. It was not an attempt to mount a miraculous comeback and reclaim his territory from the younger generation of dancers. It was a demonstration of absolute, chilling sovereignty. The atmosphere inside the Apollo on that specific night in 1955 was thick with an electric, almost reverent anticipation. The theater was packed to the absolute rafters. The older patrons in the audience remembered the terrifying perfection of his youth, the nights he had bent the laws of physics to his will. The younger dancers, the teenagers who had grown up studying the diluted remnants of his style, were waiting to witness the myth made flesh. When the announcer called his name, the eruption of the crowd was deafening, a massive wave of sound that threatened to shake the structural foundations of the building. From the wings, a figure emerged into the blinding spotlight. He was no longer the hyper-athletic, desperate teenager fighting for survival on the segregated circuit, nor was he the hollowed-out ghost battling the suffocating fog of narcotics. Reverend Bill Bailey walked to the center of the stage, possessing the regal, untouchable calm of a seasoned monarch, returning to survey a kingdom he had long ago outgrown. He was impeccably dressed, projecting a sharp, dignified, sartorial elegance that completely rejected the flashy, sequined costumes demanded by the vaudeville era. He stood before the microphone, the roaring applause crashing over him, and he simply waited. He did not smile. He did not wave his arms to stoke the frenzy. He commanded the absolute silence of the room merely by locking his spine and lowering his gaze. The jazz orchestra behind him launched into a driving, heavy swing tempo. For the first few measures, Bailey remained completely stationary, letting the chaotic, sprawling arrangement wash over him. He was a master acoustic engineer analyzing the structural integrity of the sound before initiating his strike. When his metal-plated shoe finally struck the floor, the acoustic shock wave was instantaneous. The sheer, unadulterated clarity of his rhythm cut through the heavy instrumentation of the orchestra like a razor through silk. He had not lost a single fraction of his microscopic precision. He unleashed a cascading wall of polyrhythms, dropping impossibly tight 16th note variations into the spaces between the downbeats. He was actively arguing with the brass section, dictating the tempo, completely dominating the sonic architecture of the theater. But it was not the frantic, eager exertion of his youth. His movements were dangerously contained, heavily distilled, and executed with a devastating, effortless economy of motion. The crowd was mesmerized, pinned to the backs of their seats by the sheer magnitude of his intellect. He was proving with every syncopated drop of his heel that the rhythm was not a rented commodity that Hollywood could successfully confiscate. The industry could steal the visual aesthetic. They could paste his routines onto white avatars, but they could never replicate the profound, blood-deep authenticity of the source code. And then in the final breathtaking moments of the routine, Reverend Bailey executed the masterpiece. He shifted his center of gravity with microscopic, agonizing perfection. He rose onto the ball of one foot while keeping the other perfectly flat against the oak. By manipulating the sheer kinetic friction of the floorboards and deploying a level of muscular control that defied basic anatomical logic, he initiated the illusion. He glided backward. He moved across the stage as if the heavy wooden floor had suddenly turned into a sheet of frictionless ice. He was walking forward, his legs perfectly articulating the mechanical motion of a forward stride, yet his body was smoothly, terrifyingly being pulled into reverse, the backslide. It was flawless. It was a moment of pure, unadulterated physical magic that caused a collective gasp to ripple through the massive auditorium. He floated backward, away from the microphone, away from the blinding center of the spotlight, away from the roaring epicenter of the crowd. The visual poetry of this specific movement, executed at this specific moment in his life, is overwhelmingly profound. When Bill Bailey performed the backslide in 1955, he was not merely executing a complex piece of choreography to secure a thunderous ovation. He was physically acting out his own existential trajectory. He was gliding backward, smoothly and effortlessly retreating from the agonizing parameters of the American entertainment machine. He was stepping away from the stolen intellectual property, away from the racial terror, and away from the suffocating demands of a society that refused to acknowledge his humanity. As he reached the edge of the stage, the illusion seamlessly ended. He dropped his heels, absorbing the final explosive beat of the orchestra. The Apollo Theater erupted into an absolute frenzy. It was a standing ovation of staggering proportions, a desperate, roaring demand for an encore, for a bow, for any acknowledgement from the sovereign master. In the traditional architecture of a commercial performance, this is the exact moment the artist submits to the crowd. This is when the dancer drops to his knees, flashes the mandatory wide-eyed grin, and bathes in the fleeting, intoxicating validation of the applause. Reverend Bill Bailey did none of these things. He stood perfectly still at the edge of the stage. He looked out into the blinding darkness of the auditorium with an expression of absolute, cold detachment. The Klieg lights reflected in his eyes, but the fire of ambition had been entirely extinguished. He did not smile. He did not nod. He absorbed the deafening roar of the crowd, recognized the sheer magnitude of the adoration, and fundamentally decided that he did not need it to survive. With a slow, deliberate pivot, he turned his back on the roaring audience. He did not look over his shoulder. He walked into the heavy, velvet-lined shadows of the wings, the sound of his metal plates clicking softly against the floorboards, growing fainter until he completely disappeared from view. The 1955 Apollo footage is not a promotional reel. It is not the triumphant comeback of a defeated artist begging the industry for a second chance. It is a meticulously calculated, brilliantly executed farewell. It is the permanent, irrefutable visual evidence of a man who possessed the capability to conquer the entire globe, but possessed the towering aristocratic dignity to completely refuse the throne. He stepped out of the light and walked back into the quiet sanctuary of his church, leaving behind a physical masterpiece that would eventually capture the entire world, and a spiritual legacy of defiance that remains absolutely untouchable. Fast forward to 1983. A sequined glove and a frictionless glide captivate the globe. The Moonwalk becomes Michael Jackson's undisputed signature. But pop culture operates with a deliberate, highly selective amnesia. It elevates the popularizer to the status of a god while coldly burying the architect. The masses celebrate the spectacle, entirely oblivious that the genetic code of this iconic movement was forged in the freezing alleyways of the Jim Crow South. But celluloid possesses a stubborn, unforgiving memory. The Hollywood syndicates could refuse to put Bill Bailey's name on a marquee, but they could not destroy the film. The 1943 reels of Cabin in the Sky and the raw broadcast from the Apollo Theater in 1955 stand as permanent, irrefutable indictments against a racist empire. They are the undeniable visual evidence that the greatest kinetic illusion of the century was the intellectual property of a black rhythm tap genius. Ultimately, Bill Bailey's most profound legacy is not just the physical dance. While a sequined glove eventually popularized the move globally, it was Bailey who engineered its cinematic blueprint. Yet, his supreme masterpiece was his final deliberate choreography, the ultimate backslide. Stepping backward out of Hollywood's toxic glare, he retreated into the quiet sanctuary of his own dignity, refusing to let a segregated empire have the final say.